Irene Van Zandt House was born in 1844 in New Jersey, and she died at the age of 89 in 1934 in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. At about 14, she ran away from home and shortly after married a Charles Anderson. The newspapers at the time of her trial differ. Some said that they were married, and others, like an article from 1894, where she was interviewed in jail for assaulting another former husband, said that they were never officially married. "I was not married when my first child was born," William Anderson. She also stated that my father was a successful merchant, and my parents were people of unquestioned respectability. Yet I did as I pleased. Charles and Irene quarreled often, and she eventually met Orson A. House, who the papers described as a notorious lawyer. An article from 1871 says that he made a specialty of divorce cases and advertised extensively that he would work with discontented husbands or wives. Satisfaction guaranteed or no payment. It goes on to say that he felt his duty was to win at all costs, and that perjury was an acceptable method to use. She successfully divorced Charles, and after that moved in, then married Orson. It is reported that after they married, the couple fought constantly, both threatening to kill each other often. In 1867, House bought a farm in the country. This increased the arguing as Irene preferred New York. As the arguments increased, both threatened each other's lives and then began to carry pistols with them. June 30th, 1867 was their last quarrel. House returned from New York by train at about 6 in the evening. They sat at the supper table, and Irene revived an argument from earlier about the payment of the carpenters who were at work on the new house. She wanted him to pay, and he wanted her to handle it. After supper, they went out in back of the house, and the arguing continued. House's father, who was staying with them and is blind, and added to the friction between them. According to the testimony of Mary Hamill, the younger sister of Irene, at the trial, House became violent. At the time, she and her husband lived with the Houses. She was standing in the dining room door when Irene asked Mr. House to come in and help make out the payroll. He was standing out on the porch and said he did not want to go in, but wanted to talk to his father. The senior Mr. House was then crying, and all went inside. Irene told Orson that it was a shame to make his father cry. Orson said he wished Mr. House was dead. Father House collapsed on the floor. Irene re-entered the house, followed by Orson. She was about to say something when Orson raised his fist and hit her in the forehead, knocking her down. As she fell, he kicked her, and she cried, "Oh, Orson, you have killed me." He stepped over her, grabbed her by the hair, and threw her head back against a trunk, then slapped her face and told her to shut up. Her son Willie, from her marriage to Mr. Anderson, told Mr. House, "Don't hit my mother." Mr. House then knocked him down. Mrs. House then went into her bedroom, and Mrs. Hamill backed away. Then she saw Mr. House fall out the door, though she heard no discharge of a pistol. When the deed was done, Mrs. House acted in a wildly demonstrative way for some time. She shouted to her dead husband, called for help, sent for the doctor, wrung her hands and clutched her throat, and bemoaned her dear dead husband, whom she is said to so often vowed she would kill. On cross-examination, she said that Mr. House was strong and of violent temper, and that she heard him threaten the defendant many times. On the day of the shooting, she heard him say that he would lick Mrs. House to death. William Hamill, the husband of Mary, and the rest of the witnesses testified and corroborated Mrs. House's testimony. The following day, more witnesses were called and backed what had already been said. After the other witnesses concluded, Irene took the stand and gave the same testimony. While cross-examined by the Attorney General, she says that Mr. House had threatened her with violence since the first year of marriage and knocked her down during the first year. At this stage, the Attorney General asked her if that violence continued, and all of a sudden, Mrs. House burst into a flood of tears and commenced sobbing loudly. She made a jump from the witness stand and ran around the reporter's table to where her father was seated. She took her former seat and leaned her head on the back of a chair and refused to be comforted. Her counsel began to talk to her and tried to quiet her feelings, but all to no purpose. She refused to return to the stand. The prosecutor then said that the state rested, and she continued crying all the afternoon. The defense summed up, and the court was adjourned. And on October 27, 1867, the papers reported that the jury was out for 6.5 hours and returned a verdict of acquittal. On December 2nd, the papers then reported that Irene House had become insane and been committed to the asylum. Then a follow-up article on January 30th, 1870, reported that she had become incurably insane and will remain at the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum. Then, on September 15th, 1877, the paper reported that Irene House, the woman who murdered her husband, the divorce lawyer, has been released from the New Jersey Insane Asylum. Then, on November 30th, 1867, an article is published that states that Mrs. Irene House, the Trenton murderess, thinks that she is divinely called to lecture by a vision she has had since the trial, and has actually prepared a lecture. She will travel and thinks there is a large work cut out for her. She says, "I shall never rest until I have divorce abolished for every cause all over the United States. I shall never rest until I have laws relating to schools changed, that Christianity from infancy shall be instilled as thoroughly as the alphabet, accompanying every study, and fit my charges so that sin cannot get any hold on their minds or lives." In the jail interview from 1894, she reported that she married Frank Parker. That was in February 13th, 1878, in Mercer County, New Jersey. Parker was once a famous baseball catcher. They got divorced, and next she married Paul K. Redmond because he professed to be a Christian and she thought he could help her. He didn't and tried to spend all her money, but she wouldn't let him. She claims a legal separation, but he is holding on to the farm. Because of their issues, it is claimed she assaulted him, and that is why she is currently sitting in jail. Her next marriage is known to have occurred on February 1st, 1888, in New Jersey to Theodore Johnston. She then seems to disappear from the public record. There is a death certificate for a Miss Irene A. Reed that is a good candidate for the former Mrs. House. It has her date of birth as September 7th, 1844, and her date of death as May 18th, 1934. It also includes her maiden name of Van Zandt. At some point, she had married Alfred Reed, but by the time of her death, she was a widow. A humorous story appeared on December 20th, 1876. A Detroiter who had been married but 3 months was the other day tossing over things in his wife's sewing basket, when he came across a little roll of newspaper articles about Laura Fair and Irene House. "How did you come by these?" he asked his wife as she entered the room. "Those? Why, I took great pains to cut them out and preserve them," was the reply. But how can you take such interest in reading of such women, one of whom shot a friend and the other her husband? Oh, I merely cut them out, was the evasive reply. There was a painful silence for 2 or 3 minutes, when she crossed over to him and tenderly said, "George, you needn't be afraid of me. I know I could shoot you and then secure a star lecture engagement, but I love you too well, and beside, I want you to fasten my skates on this winter." And that is the story of the Jersey murderess, Irene House.